Good afternoon. In just 7 days last June, the U.S. Supreme Court set back public health by 50 years. The court's conservative majority rolled back efforts to address the pressing threat of climate change, expanded access to deadly firearms, and of course, eliminated the right to abortion by overturning Roe versus Wade. The effects of these three decisions will reverberate across our country in the months and years ahead, with a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable among us. The harm will be significant, and this court is just getting started. In the upcoming term, the justices are preparing to hear cases on affirmative action, voting rights, businesses' right to turn away LGBTQ customers, and many more. At this first glance, these issues may not seem linked to public health, but I believe they are. We know, both intuitively and from decades of research, that our health depends on much more than the medical care we receive. Our access to education matters. So does our ability to elect representatives who will hear and respond to our needs. Exposure to bias is a major risk factor as well. Discrimination, quite literally, stresses our bodies and erodes our health. So all of these cases will deeply affect our well-being. And given the makeup of the court, I fear the worst. The journal Nature summed up the danger in an article published this week. The article is entitled "The Supreme Court's War on Science." It featured insight from a scholar, Wendy Parmet, at Northeastern University, who describes the conservative majority's recent rulings in this way, and I quote, "The through line is that they are dismissive of science and the real world impact of their decision," end quote. It can be difficult to pinpoint the most effective response to this particular threat. After all, we're not dealing with leaders who regularly put their names on a ballot. These decisions are being made by unelected justices with lifetime appointments and no public accountability. I do understand the helplessness that so many feel, but the stakes are too high to give in to despair. During an event days after the appeal of Roe versus Wade, I used the phrase "clarity is power" to describe the importance of our work. As I think about all the ways the Supreme Court is damaging public health, that phrase keeps returning to me. Clarity is power. We must be clear about the harms these decisions cause. We must be clear about who is most affected and why. And we must be clear about the actions each and every one of us can take to drive positive change. We will not make progress through silence, but our voice, our passion, our clarity can save lives. And that is powerful indeed. During this pivotal moment, I'm grateful to welcome to the Harvard Chan Studio 4 distinguished panelists who are leading the fight on some of the key issues of our time. I am looking forward to hearing their thoughts, both on the impact of the Supreme Court's recent actions and how each and every one of us can best channel our efforts to stand up for health and justice. With that, I'd like to kick things over to our moderator this afternoon, Dana Milbank, a political columnist for the Washington Post. Dana, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Dean Williams. I'm delighted to be here virtually at the Harvard Chan Studio with 4 esteemed panelists who have been closely monitoring how recent and anticipated Supreme Court rulings affect public health across the country. Dean Williams, you noted that clarity is power, and I agree. So in the interest of powerful clarity, let me be clear that I am an expert in neither constitutional law nor public health, but I do like to ask questions. One question I'm often asked by people worried about the direction of the court and the country is, what can we do about it? I don't have a better answer for them than vote, which is necessary, but not enough. That's why it's important to hear from our panelists who have been out front in responding to recent Supreme Court decisions. They can help us understand how we, as individuals and working together, can advance health and justice in our communities. So without further ado, here with us today are Mark Morial, the President and CEO of the National Urban League, Cecile Richards, the former president of Planned Parenthood and the co-founder of Supermajority, a political action committee focused on creating a government and a country that works for women. Esther Sanchez Gomez, an attorney with the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, and Leah Stokes, the Anton Vank Associate Professor of Environmental Politics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and co-host of the podcast A Matter of Degrees, a climate change podcast that started its third season this week. This event is part of the Dr. Lawrence H. and Roberta Cohn Forum series, and we thank the Cohn family for their support. So let's start with a lightning round to set the tone for our discussion. I'd like each of you to give me one word to describe how you're feeling about the Supreme Court, followed by one sentence explaining why you chose that word. A run-on sentence is acceptable, but not a paragraph, because we'll get into more detail later. Mark.
The word is politicized. And this is a Supreme Court that, instead of respecting precedent, has done a 180-degree turn on a number of issues simply because the composition of the court has changed. And new members of the court have brought their political agenda to fore and undertaken an
Whoops, so we got Mark there. All right, Cecile.
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up, I guess, where Mark left off. My word is illegitimate. And I guess maybe there's going to be a common theme here, Dana, which is this is a court that is so highly partisan and dismissive of not only judicial precedent, but I think fundamental human rights and accepted standards in this country, that it no longer is protecting the people and, in fact, is legislating from the bench, adhering to their own political points of view.
All right, thank you. Esther?
My word is transparent. I think the court has been transparent in shifting away from protecting the appearance of neutrality and restraint, which are and have been the cornerstones of their legitimacy. And they've been moving towards decision-making motivated by ideological biases that are held by the ultra-conservative majority. I think the court has lost its center, either by balance or anchor, and they're not even trying to hide it.
All right, and Leah.
Wow, well, those are great words. I'm gonna go with radical. We often act as if protecting people's rights is radical, but that's actually what we should be doing. That's normal. And what we're seeing instead is really minority rule, that we have such an extreme court that is out of step with the American people and public opinion on so many issues. For example, on abortion, the vast majority of people believe in the right to abortion. It's something like 85%. On climate change, we similarly have, vast majorities above 70% of people who want action. So this is really a radical minority that is trying to take away the rights of the majority.
All right, a politicized, illegitimate, and transparently radical court. We've got a lot of fans of the Roberts Court on board today. Now let's take a deeper dive. I would like each of you to take 2 or 3 minutes to explain how the Supreme Court has reshaped or is expected to reshape the landscape in your particular field. Cecile, let's start with you. The Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade was a political earthquake. In its immediate aftermath, conservative lawmakers have been floating big plans, including a federal abortion ban. There have also been proposed laws blocking women from crossing state lines to end pregnancies and criminalizing sending or receiving abortion medication in the mail. Lately, we've seen some abortion opponents tone down the rhetoric, Republican candidates in some states have been deleting the most extreme anti-abortion rhetoric from their websites. Yet just this week, Lindsey Graham introduced legislation that would ban abortions nationwide after 15 weeks of pregnancy. So where do you see things going from here? Where do you expect the anti-abortion movement, the court, and abortion rights generally to go?
So Dana, you're totally right. The Dobbs decision was a political earthquake, and it is having aftershocks that are continuing on, because of course now we have 15 states that have banned abortion. We expect that to grow to 15, to 25, 26, of course, and each week there are more and more stories. So unlike many Supreme Court decisions that are sort of a flash in the pan and then people forget, this in fact is in front of the American people and American voters every day. I think that I actually just got a poll from the Perry Undum firm that it literally came out today, and I think it was really interesting. A couple pieces that I took out of it that we could underscore here. One of the fascinating things is everyone in America knows about this decision, which, as you know, as a political reporter, usually, most people don't even, well, anyway, there's a lot of things folks don't know, but this poll actually said that 97% of voters in this country are aware of the Roe versus Wade being overturned, and that 73% of them are discussing it, which is phenomenal. We are seeing now, and they polled on what voters are thinking. Women's rights is now a higher voting priority than before the Dobbs decision, including a 16-point shift with Republican women, a critical group of voters that can swing in this election. Men who have always been pro-choice but have not always voted that way. Men who are of reproductive age now rate this as a very high voting priority. Republican women are more likely to now support pro-choice candidates. And women of color in particular are extremely aware of all the possible impacts in their own lives and in their own communities. The other interesting thing is that the intensity on voting is on the side of people who support Roe versus Wade, and the vast majority of this country support Roe, and 80% of voters in this survey said that banning abortion will not make it go away. It will simply make it illegal. So I think this is a long-term reshifting of the voter intensity, the real belief in people that this is not a Texas or Mississippi problem. This is now a problem that affects every single family in the United States. Anyway, I'll end. I could go on talking about Kansas, but I know we were short on time, so I'll stop with that.
Right, and we'll get into it more later. And certainly there's been a huge increase in voter turnout in the special elections and anticipated turnout in the midterm, which supports what you're saying. Leah, let's turn to environmental policy. By that same 6-3 majority that was in Dobbs, the court restricted the EPA's authority to regulate carbon emissions from power plants. Yet congressional Democrats enacted what they call the Inflation Reduction Act, which President Biden signed last month and includes about $370 billion in climate-related spending. Can you explain the significance of the court's ruling? What will be the next legal battlegrounds? And do you expect that the new climate legislation could face legal jeopardy?
Great questions. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to the work that Cecile Richards is doing. It's so important, and I think we're going to see massive turnout. I'm very hopeful for that, and that's, of course, going to depend on people working really hard to make that happen. But, I do feel hopeful despite how terrible it is for so many people right now in this country. So on climate change, we got to do a little bit of history, and I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough law to fake it, I suppose. In 2007, there was a court case called Massachusetts versus EPA, and the state of Massachusetts sued the EPA and said that under the Clean Air Act, they had a requirement to regulate greenhouse gases if they posed an endangerment to Americans' health, right? This is about health. That's what the Clean Air Act is about. It's about public health. And they won at that Supreme Court in 2007. And so the Bush administration dragged their feet, and eventually the Obama administration issued that endangerment finding, which means that under the Clean Air Act, bedrock legislation, they actually have a requirement to deal with greenhouse gases. The very tail end of the Obama administration, they put together a plan. It was called the Clean Power Plan. It was a way to basically say that power companies needed to clean up their electricity mix, right? So rather than burning coal, you should burn some renewables. That was immediately challenged in this court case, West Virginia versus EPA. And the really crazy thing there is that the Supreme Court actually stayed the implementation of the Clean Power Plan. That was very unprecedented. They couldn't even implement the plan. And so in some ways, what this court case has been about for quite a long time is kind of an irrelevant policy because it was never implemented. It didn't exist. That being said, you know, a lot of us were waiting for this case to come down and we're really worried. And in some ways, it was not as bad as it thought it could be, in that all they said was that, yes, the Clean Air Act says you can and must regulate greenhouse gases, that if they pose an endangerment to Americans' health, but you can't do it in a way that's, quote, outside the fence line, which basically means you've got to say, put a scrubber, that's a piece of pollution control technology on the power plant. You can't say this power plant can be trading with that solar farm and doing it that way. So, you know, there were some restrictions, but people need to not forget that we still have the authority to deal with greenhouse gas regulation, greenhouse gases. And in fact, we have the requirement under Massachusetts versus EPA. Now, there's another part of the case that's terrible and we should not overlook, which is the major questions doctrine. This is a very radical doctrine that the right has been developing. It has really no basis and it's been highly criticized, for example, in the dissent of this case. But the basic thing is that now the court could say, this is a major question. This is going to affect the economy or going to be so important that, no, you can't do it, the administration. And that is kind of like carte blanche, right? They could say that anything is a major question. And so that's where people are really concerned. And there are other cases, for example, trying to say that the EPA cannot regulate car and truck pollution, which they've done for a very long time under the same kind of theory. So that's where people are really concerned. What kind of precedent does this create under the major questions doctrine? I will leave you with one positive thought, which is that the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law, and I worked very hard on with a lot of other people, huge deal. There are some really smart folks who snuck some provision into that law, and there's been some great reporting about this by Lisa Friedman in the New York Times. And they actually, those provisions reaffirm that the EPA has a requirement to regulate carbon pollution, greenhouse gas pollution. And so in some ways, we now have more authority, we have more legal sort of bulwarks to make sure that we can take on climate change. So I'm actually pretty optimistic, and I hope people don't get too depressed about this particular case, although it does have that major questions element, which is very concerning.
All right, well, let's hear it for sneaky provisions. That's some good news. Esther, this is now a familiar refrain. The same 6-3 majority on the court dealt a significant blow to gun control in June. Court held that Americans have a general right to carry a gun outside the home and said states could not require citizens to prove that they have a proper cause to carry those weapons. This ruling struck down a New York gun control law and put similar laws at risk in Massachusetts, California, and elsewhere. What fallout have you seen from this ruling? And with this court clearly inclined to side with expansive gun rights, how does that affect your strategy as you advocate for policies designed to reduce violence?
Thanks, Dana. You know, when we talk about this case, I think it's important to set the scene for when the decision came down. We were 1 day shy of a month after the Uvalde massacre and about a month and a half after Buffalo. And so we can only assume that the justices had these tragedies in mind as they were exchanging drafts in the court. And with all of the great public health research that was before them, but both by amici and by the parties, when they were considering this case, with all of that in mind, they still decided to place gun rights above public safety. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And they did so in a way that was essentially we make the rules, so we win. And I don't really think that there's any other way to go about it, describing it. They in the way that Leo was describing with the change in the methodology, the court in Bruen also changed the methodology, and this is one of the big fallouts. You mentioned New York's law. It was a particular feature of New York's law that also called into question the law in 600 other states. Those states are and have been working very quickly to address that gap and to make sure that their public carry licensing schemes are up to snuff and are still functioning in a constitutionally permissible manner. But what we're going to be seeing going forward is, because they shifted the law and the standard for evaluating constitutional challenges under the Second Amendment so drastically, we're going to be seeing sort of the lower courts trying to come up to speed with this new standard, which really created more questions than answers. And it's a history-focused standard that now takes public health research out of its spotlight, which is where it sat under the previous methodology, which was an interest balancing test. And so, you know, people like me are working to develop records to give courts the tools to continue to uphold gun safety regulations across the country. I think it's worth mentioning in the context of this conversation, so focused on public health, Justice Alito in his concurrence went so far as to mock the social science research about gun violence regulations, prevention regulations, and the way that they are proven to reduce gun violence, and decided to elevate, you know, his own sort of ideologically biased anecdotes above that public health research. But, you know, we're not giving up on social science and public health research for legislators. They should still be making informed decisions when they pass gun safety regulations. You know, that should never leave the conversation. What we're changing is the way that we describe it to courts. And the conversation, I think, it's worth mentioning that the court doesn't really take Second Amendment cases very often. This was the first one in a decade. We don't know what they're going to do going forward. They are not obligated to take or not take these cases, but we're focusing our attention outside of the Second Amendment space. You know, some of what Leah was talking about is relevant in gun policy as well, which is, you know, the ATF has a regulatory authority to promulgate rules, and we expect that there will be some debates, especially after the ghost gun rule that was passed this year, about how much authority ATF has to promulgate those rules and to issue agency interpretation of laws. And, you know, for my part, we're looking to bring the fight to the gun industry directly by creating accountability, you know, through the courts in the way that every other industry is regulated. We should be holding the gun industry accountable in the same way.
All right. I'm shocked to hear that Justice Alito is not considering legitimate science, since he is firmly grounded in the science of the Middle Ages. Now, let's finally turn to Mark. We lost you briefly there on your first answer, so if you want to finish that as well. But I'd like to ask you about two cases that will soon come before the Supreme Court. There's an affirmative action case that seeks to ban universities from considering race as one factor among many in admissions. And there's a very important voting rights case, Moore versus Harper, that could have a tremendous impact on voting rights and the future of democracy. There's concern that the justices could use this case to assert that state legislatures have complete control over elections. That would mean the courts could not step in to stop extreme gerrymandering or severe restrictions on voting access. What are you anticipating from the court in these cases, and what impact could these rulings have, especially for communities of color?
Yeah, and I didn't realize you all had lost me at the beginning because I just continued to keep on talking. But let me frame it this way. This court is seeking to repeal 50 years of constitutional jurisprudence when it comes to the nation's march towards racial justice. Its intentionality appears to be to wholesale chip away and repeal. And we saw in the Dobbs decision their willingness to overturn 50 years of precedent. And the march now is to do it in the racial justice arena by using what I call hocus pocus logic, twisted, tortured, vague logic, the invention of novel theories, the hijacking of time-honored methods of interpreting the Constitution. So in the decision in North Carolina, which is a dangerous decision, the court is poised because those opposed to what the North Carolina Supreme Court did, which was basically invalidate its own legislature's reapportionment plan as being gerrymandered and racially motivated. So here's the North Carolina Supreme Court exercising powers under the North Carolina state constitution, utilizing its power to review time-honored American jurisprudential policy or practice that the courts can review an act of the legislature to determine whether it is consistent with the Constitution. And here you have right-wing extremists appealing to the United States Supreme Court to overturn, now hear this, overturn the actions of a state Supreme Court when it comes to the interpretation of its own constitution, suggesting somehow that a legislative act is immune from judicial review by the legislature's own judicial system or the state's own judicial branch of government. Why do I call it hocus pocus logic? In one instance, in Dobbs, this court says states' rights are supreme. In another decision, in the New York gun case, the court says no, the actions of a state, in that case, New York, is not supreme. We say that the federal Constitution, and we've interpreted, is supreme. And in this case, in the North Carolina case, once again, it's an action to overturn the actions of a state when it comes to a state Supreme Court acting in favor of racial justice. And then in the other affirmative action case, it's the Supreme Court, once again, about to knock out affirmative action and the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which has been time-honored since the 1960s. This is an extreme, radical political court because not only are they torturing the Constitution, they're torturing their own reputation, the legitimacy of the court, and acting in a manner inconsistent not only with precedent, but really with the sentiment of the nation. When it comes to the Constitution, and I always vigorously disagree with Antonin Scalia and the original intent mentality, the Constitution is not a statute. The Constitution is a document of values and philosophy and should not be interpreted like a statute where it is all about the plain wording and the plain meaning, because a statute can be amended and modified at any time by a legislative body. But that the power of the American Constitution is in its values applied to, if you will, the times in which we live today as the Constitution or as the Supreme Court applied it previously. So in both of these cases, the Moore case, which deals with gerrymandering and racial justice in North Carolina, and in the possibility that affirmative action, which really means whether race can be used as a factor in college admissions, not the determinative factor, not the only factor, this Supreme Court is poised to overturn 50 years of racial justice and 50 years of constitutional interpretations which support the end of this nation's long history of discrimination. So I am not optimistic, but I want to be, if you will, prayerful and hopeful that this Supreme Court will recognize that the way in which the public has reacted to Dobbs should send a signal that this court continues to undermine its own legitimacy. And Justice Roberts last week said, people should not challenge the legitimacy of the court because, quote unquote, they disagree with this decision. Justice Roberts, no, it's that the court changes simply because it has new members. It's acting like a political body through and through, and the American people respect that and understand that. We have fought too long and too hard, and the Supreme Court has generally been one of the important institutions in the nation's march towards racial justice and in overcoming its ugly history of Plessy and the Dred Scott decision and many others. For us to be silent, for us to be inactive, or for us to feel powerless as this Supreme Court, if you will, seeks to literally repeal the last 50 to 70 years of constitutional jurisprudence. I'm outraged.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. And I had been wondering, since the Supreme Court effectively abolished stare decisis, what Latin phrase would replace it. And now we know it is going to be hocus pocus.
Yes, sir.
All right. So let's mix this up a little bit. When you look at polling on all of these issues, it's clear the court's decisions in these cases often run counter to public opinion. So as advocates in your respective fields, you're not necessarily trying to persuade the public to back your view. In many cases, the public is already there. Instead, you need to think about how to make progress when the Supreme Court is squarely against you. So how does that affect your strategies? And anybody who wants to jump in here, please do so.
Well, I'll just say that there's research in political science from people like Maya Sen, who's at Harvard, that looks at public opinion in the Supreme Court. And, the court could really undermine itself if it continues along this illegitimate path that is so counter to the public's will. We haven't talked about this, but we see what's going on with Justice Thomas as well, and his relationship to the January 6th. I don't know what you call that, attempted coup, maybe. That is a very illegitimate thing. I do feel that when the court gets out of step with the public, that can really undermine its legitimacy and have really big impacts on the court. So I think that they are really getting to be quite radical. And maybe if we're so lucky as to get enough Democrats in the House and the Senate, and we will start to see some of these things codified in law finally that we haven't, and maybe also see additional people appointed to the Supreme Court, which people have been talking about for a long time.
And look, I believe that the concept of Supreme Court reform, there are those who have talked about expansion of the court, those who talked about term limits. It's interesting to me that there's no ethical code other than, quote, the Code of Ethics for Lawyers that applies to the court. No standards around recusation. Justice Thomas clearly should be recused from any case involving anything emanating from January 6th due to the actions and the participation and the political predisposition of his spouse. And there are no cameras in the courtroom, no ability for people to see the proceedings or understand the arguments that are being made or the questions that take place. So while we've long respected the court's ability to kind of be suspended in animation from a time point of view, I think the actions of the court challenges legitimacy and will increase calls for reform around a wide range of aspects and elements of the operation of the Supreme Court. And so be it. And I think that debate is fair, that debate is necessary, and that debate is needed because the public also recognizes, and this has to be said, that effectively Mitch McConnell hijacked two seats. On one hand, he blocked consideration of Garland, quote unquote, because it was in an election year. On the other hand, he enabled the nomination and confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett under the very same time circumstances as he blocked Merrick Garland. So his credibility and the manner in which these justices were seated raised considerable issues around how, in fact, they were seated. The situation appeared abjectly political, and now you have abjectly political decisions from the very same court.
Cecilia, you want to add something quickly?
Yeah, I just think, well, all of these things I think are important considerations, expansion of the court, et cetera. We know the court is at a record low, I think, now in terms of approval. But ultimately, this is about political power, and we all know that. And so none of these things are going to change unless we actually can change the political calculation and representation. And so to me, right now, this is a court, and I'm glad that Mark and others have brought up this whole, sort of the bogus idea of states' rights, which of course, with abortion in particular, you know, the Republicans believe in states' rights until they gain control of Congress. And then believe me, we will have a national abortion ban. And so I do think we have to build political power if we do believe, and I think on all the issues we're talking about, voting, on climate, on guns, on the right to make your own decisions about your pregnancies, these are majoritarian supported issues, but we have to demonstrate that we can build the political power to make a difference. And I do think Kansas was a beginning. I mean, that was a state where no one would have expected an abortion a referendum to be defeated that would have outlawed abortion, and yet it won by almost 20 points in a state where 51% of the voters were Republicans. The state of Michigan, where I just returned from yesterday, there's a ballot initiative that is now on the ballot to ensure that there is safe and legal abortion in the state. Again, after the Dobbs decision, an explosion of voter registration, of voter engagement. That's what we're seeing around the country, but that is how we're going to have to change this, because frankly, until the Republican Party begins to lose elections because of the very issues we're talking about, we are not going to have the kind of political change that we need. And I think on a lot of these issues too, we're going to need both a state-based, to build state-based power to really, engage voters in the local area. And then of course we need to pass federal legislation, particularly when it relates to abortion rights. This is an issue that is supported overwhelmingly by people in America, but the Supreme Court doesn't care. And until we change who's in office, we won't be able to change their opinion either.
All right. Now, Cecile mentioned bogus ideas, and indeed, another complication for you as advocates and activists is the rise of disinformation. I've written a whole lot about the weaponization of disinformation by the right, and a series of endlessly repeated falsehoods had made it impossible to reach consensus or even to have a sensible discussion in our political discourse. Has any of you found a way to respond effectively to the pervasive use of disinformation? I know, Esther, or anybody else want to, have you found the magic bullet?
I don't know if I found the magic bullet, but one thing that we've been seeing in the gun violence prevention space is that a lot of times the gun industry and its actors through the NRA or the NSSF try to create this false dichotomy where either you're a patriot and you want all of the guns all the time everywhere, or you're part of the problem that's trying to disarm everyone. And that's simply false. And I think that this ties into the last conversation about the political will. I think that there's a lot of political will for for conversations about modest, common sense, life-saving measures in the gun violence space. But because of this dichotomy, people are afraid to stand up for them. And so one thing that we've been doing at Giffords is creating a coalition of gun owners who are for gun violence prevention regulations to counter the narrative that it's one or the other, that you either have to have, militarized weapons, weapons of war in, every street, in protests and wherever, or you're, trying to take everyone's guns. It's not one or the other. We can make steps towards reducing violence, towards saving lives, and we can do it from both sides of the aisle.
All right.
I would, you framed a very important question, and it requires an understanding of the right's approach to political communications and messaging, which is based on their side research, the notion of emotionalization to camouflage disinformation, and the discipline of repetition of simple themes and simple slogans to try to move public opinion or to create false outrage amongst their supporters. And if you follow Fox News, and I read a book I would recommend to all, because you've always got to study your adversaries, and it's a book on Roger Ailes called The Loudest Voice in the Room, and it, for the most part, gives you an insight into this strategy of always framing conversation with a narrative that includes an antagonist. And in order to counteract this type of political communication, it is not simply about having facts and a message. It's also about thinking very long and hard about how the information we're talking about here can be clearly effectively and repetitively communicated to people. And that requires research, it requires discipline, and it is a science. We're not dealing with, on the right, clumsy, ill-considered, thoughtless, non-researched communication.
Right.
You're dealing with something very carefully curated. And
Right.
I think we've got to fight fire, you have to have water or fire,
All right.
right?
Dana, can I say something on this?
Yeah, real quick, because I want to make sure we get everything in, but yeah.
Yeah,
real
I'm
quick,
just going to
please.
say, because I just think because we are with this, the Howard Chan School of Public Health, I don't think we have the answers to this question, but I do think this is such a ripe area for students of public health. And because, we saw healthcare misinformation during COVID and began to understand sort of how massive and widespread this can be. We are now seeing in a post-Dobbs world. I was looking the other day at there's a huge volume of people searching to find where they can get access to safe and legal abortion now, particularly people who are in prohibited states. 37% of Google Map searches will lead them not to an abortion provider, but to a fake clinic. There is massive amount of disinformation too about medication abortion, about I wouldn't go into all the things they say because we've seen this in birth control too, massive disinformation.
Yeah.
I think it is a really important area for public health professionals to think about how are you going to attack this on a much more widespread basis to get good information out there.
Great.
And we do have one model from public health that's worked that the climate community has really locked onto. Climate disinformation is as tale as old as climate science. And what is the model? It's about big tobacco. Big tobacco lied about research. They lied about cigarettes causing cancer. That eventually became a court case, right? And they were held responsible for that. And that is exactly the narrative we're using in the climate space right now. We're saying that big oil lied. They did it for financial reasons, and people are trying to hold them accountable. And just yesterday in the House Oversight Committee, there were emails and new documents from a host of fossil fuel companies showing what they're saying internally. And I just released a paper last week about electric utilities and their own role in promoting climate denial. So, we have this is a narrative, as we were just hearing from Mark, about villains, right? And about financial interests. We're saying, why are they spreading these lies? Because they're making money off of compromising other people's health through air pollution and through destabilizing the climate.
Okay, perfect. And on the topic of speaking the truth, we're going to turn now to a short clip from a woman I greatly admire, former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. She was just beginning her third term in 2011 when she was shot in the head at a constituent event and 6 others were killed. Since then, she's become a powerful advocate for gun control. We asked her what advice she would give ordinary Americans who feel despondent after these Supreme Court decisions. Let's hear her response.
Our lives can change so quickly. Mine did when I was shot, but I never gave up hope. I chose to make a new start, to move ahead, to not look back. I'm relearning so many things, how to walk, how to talk, and I'm fighting to make the country safer. It can be so difficult. Losses hurt. Setbacks are hard, but I tell myself, move ahead. I'm finding joy in small things. Ride my bike, playing the French horn, going to the gym, laughing with friends. The small things add up. We are living in challenging time, but we are up for the challenge. My own recovery has taken years. Many, many people have helped me along the way, and I've learned so much. I've learned when people care for each other and work together, progress is possible, a better world is possible. But change doesn't happen overnight, and we can't do it alone. Join me, let's move ahead together. Thank you very much.
Wow, she's inspiring every time I hear her. So the small things add up. Gabby Gifford said. So let's see how to put into practice that advice. Well, we all know that voting is essential, as I mentioned earlier, but beyond that, what steps can and should individuals take to try to make a difference on these issues that we've been discussing? And again, anybody with ideas, please jump in.
Well, I just want to say that in political science, there's research by Regina Bateson, which shows exactly the Congresswoman's story, which is that victims, people who are victims of whether it's, a gun violence or climate events, or even a victim of not being able to get access to reproductive health care. And that can, really cause huge harms to families, or victims of discrimination, all these issues that we're talking about, that actually makes people politically mobilize. And we're going to see that happening right now. You might think that being a victim is demobilizing, but the research says otherwise. So we have to connect the dots to the fact that this erosion of our rights and our public health is hurting us, and use that to really fuel our activism. And I think that persistence and getting involved can actually lead to really big changes. In the climate space, we're constantly asked, what can I do? What can I do? People really care, and they are seeing these changes every day. And the number one thing we say is join a group. So why do we say that? Because groups can help you plug in. They can help you go to a protest. They can help you work on a bill. They can help you, with donations to do voter mobilization. I have been working on climate change for 20 years. And honestly, I can't say I felt like I was having a big impact until I joined a group. And now I can say I got billions of dollars passed through Congress. And that was just because I joined with others. So there are amazing groups like Moms Demand and Everytown for gun violence. There's awesome groups, of course, like Planned Parenthood, and the others could tell you the better groups. In my space, there's fantastic groups you can join on climate, Sierra Club, 350. I really think people should get involved. Don't think you have to do it on your own or reinvent the wheel. There are organizations out there that can help you get involved.
And for us, we offer an opportunity for people to get involved with the National Urban League, both by joining a local chapter, including young professional chapters that we have that are focused on people under 40, or by becoming, in effect, an online member or supporter. And I couldn't agree more that there's power in togetherness, power in collective action, power in feeding and interacting with others who share your thoughts, views, hopes, aspirations, and fears. I'll just say one thing that I think is missing in America today, and I think we've lost this focus in the elementary schools, the middle schools, and the high schools to teach civics, to teach the Constitution, to teach the Bill of Rights, to teach separation of powers, to help people understand the system of representative democracy, citizenship and participation and civic engagement, and the history of the progress of the 20th century. When it is learned, when it is taught with accuracy and correctness, is a powerful engine. It's a powerful fuel for the next generation to understand its responsibility to protect past gains and eradicate past injustices. And I think all of us need to be advocates for that. But I agree, being active and involved, all of us here are in the civic space. Harvard University is in the preparation of tomorrow's leaders in a wide range and variety of fields. And that entire process to prepare, to educate, to motivate, and enable the next generation is got to be a high priority for all of us today here in the early decades of the 21st century.
Okay. We've got a bunch of questions from the audience today. We probably have time for a couple of them. So let me throw one out there at you and see if anybody wants to get at this. This one I think is very important. We're asked, how can we improve voter turnout in the younger population? We were talking earlier about the majoritarian support for many of these issues we're talking about, but people don't always show up at the polls. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, Dana, really glad that someone asked that question because so I just looked at the Kansas turnout for the abortion initiative referendum, and there was a 33% increase in young voters turning out in Kansas. We're seeing as well a spike in my home state of Texas in voter registration among young people. Young people are agitated and they are concerned. And so I think it is really important, one, to invest in organizations that are working with young people, registering them to vote, encouraging them to vote. Next Gen is a good example, but there are others. And the other thing I would like to say about young people is that this is a very scary time to be a young person. I don't care whether it's a scary time to be going to school. It's a scary time because you can no longer control your own decisions about pregnancy. But this is also a time, I think, in addition to reaching out to young people about voting, it's just a time to like reach young people and bring them closer because all of the things that are being done, all the issues that we are talking about are falling disproportionately on young people and young voters in America.
We were in a conversation just yesterday overviewing our fall campaign called Reclaim Your Vote. And a great focus on it is activations amongst those under 30. My own view is I was a young elected official. I was elected to the legislature in Louisiana in my very early 30s. I was elected mayor in New Orleans at 35. I had an opportunity to be part of a whole group of us in New Orleans who were under 40, who ran for public office to challenge the then existing status quo, and almost all of us won. I think it's not only appeal, but I do think we need a generation of elected officials across the board who are younger. It is not to participate in ageism. It is relevance and resonance is very important in motivating voters, and young voters. You get maybe older and you vote as a responsibility and by habit. When you're younger, you may vote if you're motivated by the issue, if you're motivated by the candidate. I think the reproductive rights debate has motivated many young voters. Police misconduct and the Black Lives Matter movement motivated young voters in 2020. My own son, who's 20, said to me, I asked him, are you and your friends going to vote in the midterm? He said, we were motivated by Black Lives Matter. Didn't say anything about candidates. He says, right now, this is just before Dobbs, we're not motivated. We don't have this, I don't feel the same fire, Dad. We've got to recognize that too many times, young people are talked about, talked at, and not talked to, and not listened to. And so in today's world with Gen Zs and millennials fast becoming a majority of the electorate and a majority of the population, those movements, those issues, those candidates, those political parties that really, really focus on those generations will govern the nation for the decades to come. And I think it's a pretty fundamental. I think there's a basic dynamic about it. If you listen to people who run for office, they'll sit there and say, we're not mailing to people under 30. We're not going to do that television commercial because we just presume they don't vote, which is short-sighted and to me a defeatist mentality. So those are some of my observations. I'm very passionate about this because I was active as a young person and ran for office as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention at 24, 25, because many young people were doing it at that time. This was in the middle 1980s. So it's all about talking to and listening to young people, understanding that they are full participants as citizens and not ignoring them, and making sure that the issues they're concerned about are central to the conversation.
I would add two things quickly to that. There's actually political science research by Stephen Solbacher, also at Harvard, that shows that a big reason why young people vote is not because they don't care or anything like that. It's because they move. They fall off the registration list by just moving. And so that is why it's so important that we have groups out there and we're investing in groups to re-register people because they just move more frequently. That's actually a huge amount of the gap between voting when you're young and voting when you're old can be explained just by moving because you're moving a lot of places. I'll say the second thing to build on what Mark was saying, that if you think about what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been doing, right, on the left and to young people, she is a young woman. She speaks to so many people. I'm obviously a huge fan of her. And she talks about these issues. She went directly on Instagram when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. And she talks to millions of young people. And I think that the Democratic Party has to do more to elevate people like her. There was just an amazing interview with her in GQ where she talked about how alienated she has been by the party. And that's just wrong because she is an unbelievably talented person who speaks to young people, who speaks to people of color, who speaks to women. And, you know, we need to be, as a party, as the Democratic Party, lifting up people like this because that is really what's going to motivate people to turn out.
I could just hop in. I think that these are all really excellent points. And I just wanted to mention there are youth-led organizations in the gun violence prevention space. March for Our Lives, for example, has a really unique point of view that they can bring to this conversation. In addition to elevating, I think that what Cecile said about it being scary to be a young person right now is absolutely right. And the reason it's scary is because the problems feel like, you know, you feel helpless. And helplessness is scary. But I think just to bring it back to a conversation about public health research is what gives us the tools to solve these problems, particularly in gun violence prevention space, where we need to understand what kind of regulations we need to stop things like mass shootings at schools. You know, it's not like a helplessness, you know, we have the tools and researchers in the public health space are teaching us how to use these tools. And young people can be the ones advocating for them because they're the ones most affected. So definitely getting together young people, empowering them to have these conversations and giving them the tools like public health research is a hugely important part of this conversation.
All right, perfect. So let's close this out by going around the horn one more time. So we started with me asking you about how each of you feels about the court. Let's wrap up with a key takeaway for the audience, for everyday people out there who want to advance the cause of health and justice. What's your simple, clear message for them in just a sentence or two? Let's say, start with Mark.
Get involved and vote. Supreme Court justices and federal judges are picked by the president and confirmed by the Senate. That process involves all of us as voters if we turn out and vote. So my message is vote and be civically and politically engaged.
Cecile?
My message would be tell your story. And I feel like one of the ways that we got to this place with abortion, even though 1 in 4 women have had an abortion in the United States, it's been in the shadows, it's been stigmatized. And so thank goodness, finally, people are talking about this as a healthcare issue, which it is. So if you can, tell your own story. And if you're a healthcare provider, the stories that are coming out right now from oncologists, from high-risk OBGYNs, from Cleveland Clinic this week in the New York Times, it is really important to have the medical voice in this conversation about why access to reproductive health care is not a political issue, it's a medical healthcare issue.
All right. Esther?
My message would be have courage. And that's a quote to the wonderful Gabby Giffords, who's the leader of my organization. She always says that the fight takes courage. And, you know, even though right now it feels like the court lacks that courage, we don't. And our families, our communities, our country deserves to be safe. So we need to keep on fighting, and we can do so with courage.
And Leah?
I would say what I said before, join an organization. The cool and terrible thing about climate change is that carbon pollution cuts across all of society. It's happening in your house when you turn on your stove. That is a carbon machine, right? And it's actually, from a public health perspective, poisoning you. We're learning that gas stoves are leaking even when they're turned off. Guess what? You can work in your community to ban gas in new constructions. You can work to actually pass laws at the state level to provide subsidies and support so people can get induction stoves and heat pumps. That's just happening California. And of course, you can work federally, but it doesn't all have to be federally focused. We have to make progress on these issues at the state, local, and national level. And so join an organization, and there's actually huge change you can make, and it's really fun to win.
All right. Well, Mark, Cecile, Esther, and Leah, thank you all so much
Dana.
for this. Oh, you have something quick there?
Just said thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I feel a lot smarter and even a little bit more hopeful. So if any of you missed any of this, you can view the recording on demand on Harvard Chan School's YouTube page. Thank you for watching, and have a good afternoon.
Take good care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.